Breaking tonight from Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, a community most Canadians have never visited, in a part of the country most foreign leaders pretend doesn't exist. Something has shifted. A 5,000-kilometer snowmobile trek by the Canadian Rangers wrapped last month across the high Arctic. And the people watching closest were not in Washington. They were in Nuuk, in Copenhagen, in Helsinki, Oslo, Stockholm, Reykjavik. For 3 years, Greenland and Denmark have been quietly sitting down with Canadian officials, asking the same question over and over again. How do you do it? How does a country with so few people and so much ice hold a presence across territory larger than most of Europe? The answer, every single time, has been the Rangers. A reserve force scattered across communities so remote that helicopters sometimes take days to arrive. Inuit, Cree, Dene, Métis, settlers who know the land because they were born on it. That's the model Greenland wants. That's the model Denmark wants. And the timeline accelerated the moment Donald Trump opened his mouth about annexation. Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Whitney Lackenbauer was on that snowmobile trek. He's also one of the Canadian officials sitting across the table from the Greenlanders. His words, delivered to Reuters from somewhere in the high Arctic, cut through the noise. The rhetoric coming out of the White House has sped up efforts to rebuff the idea that Arctic communities need the United States to come in and save them. Translation: Greenland doesn't want saving, it wants partners, and it's looking north, not south. Dear viewers, pause on that for a moment. For 70 years, the architecture of Arctic security ran through Washington. NORAD, DEW Line, Pituffik, the base most of the world still calls Thule. Every doctrine assumed American leadership and Canadian compliance. Now in May 2026, a Danish territory is asking a Canadian reserve unit to help it build its own defense backbone. And the conversations are happening without American mediation. That is not a small adjustment. That is a tectonic shift in how the top of the world is governed. If you want to understand how Canada is repositioning itself in this new global order before the headlines catch up, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We track these movements daily, and what's happening in the Arctic right now is going to define the next decade. Let's go back to how we got here. The timeline matters. In February of this year, Canada opened a consulate in Nuuk, the first permanent diplomatic post Ottawa has ever held inside Greenland. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand flew in. Governor General Mary Simon raised the flag. More than 70 Inuit delegates from across Canada chartered a flight to stand beside them, and every Nordic foreign ministry was watching closely. In March in Oslo, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat across from Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and the leaders of the 4 other Nordic states. By the end of that summit, all 6 governments, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, had signed on to deepen cooperation in military procurement, defense production, and cyber defense. One agreement, 6 flags, 0 American signatures. Then April arrived. Alexander Stubb became the first Finnish president to set foot in Canada in 12 years. He and Carney signed Arctic cooperation agreements, then walked over to a rink in Ottawa and played hockey. Stubb later told reporters they message each other almost every day, sometimes about sports. Most of the time, he said, about NATO, Ukraine, and Iran. Heads of state do not exchange daily messages by accident. That is a relationship being built brick by brick, in real time, while Washington threatens the people they're building it with. Frederiksen put it most plainly back in Oslo. The old world order is gone, she told reporters, and will probably not come back. So we have to build something new, and it has to be a world order built on the values we represent. Translation: she's not waiting for Washington to come to its senses. The Danes know it. The Finns know it. And Carney, a former central banker who spent years inside the Anglo-American financial system, knows it better than almost anyone. Now zoom out. There are 8 Arctic states. Russia has more bases above the tree line than any other nation on Earth. And over the last several years, China has wedged itself into the region, mostly riding on Russian infrastructure. The ice is melting. Shipping lanes are opening. Critical minerals, the kind that power the entire electric and defense economy, are sitting under the seabed and beneath the permafrost. Whoever controls access controls the next century of industrial policy. That is the prize. That is what every move on this chessboard is actually about. And here is where the Canadian story turns uncomfortable. For decades, Canada was the laggard. Among the 8 Arctic states, Canadian defense spending, the North consistently ranked near the bottom, below Russia, below the United States, below Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. Only Greenland itself spent less. In 2014, Canadian defense spending sat at roughly 1% of GDP. 1%. For a country with the world's longest Arctic coastline. Last year, after years of pressure, much of it from Trump himself, ironically, Canada finally hit the 2% NATO target, around $63 billion. The math has changed, the mindset has changed, and the timing was not accidental. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has been driving the diplomatic side of this pivot. She told Reuters she meets regularly with her Nordic counterparts on collective defense and Arctic security. NORAD, she stressed, remains critical. Canada is not walking away from continental defense with the United States. But here is the important part. Canada is now building parallel structures, new alliances, new supply chains, new procurement pipelines that do not begin and end in American factories. Anand has invited every Nordic foreign minister to visit Canada's Arctic this year. They are coming, all of them. Dear viewers, you are watching a country quietly insure itself against the unreliability of its closest neighbor. Not by breaking the alliance, by building a backup. Lackenbauer said something else worth lingering on. The more Canada helps its allies in Northern Europe, he argued, the more hostile nations will get the message that they don't get a free pass in the Arctic. Translation: deterrence works when it's collective. A lone Canadian Coast Guard cutter in the Beaufort Sea does not scare Moscow. A coordinated rapid response framework stretching from the Beaufort to the Barents Sea does. That is the strategic logic behind the Nordic embrace. Canada gains weight by association. The Nordics gain depth by adding the second largest country on Earth to their northern flank. Neil O'Rourke is the Director General for Fleet and Maritime Services at the Canadian Coast Guard. Years ago, he and a Danish counterpart looked at a map and reached a conclusion that should have been obvious decades earlier. If either side had a serious incident in the high Arctic, the first phone call would not be to Washington or Brussels. It would be to each other. They are just across the water from one another. Calling south makes no sense when help can come from the next fjord over. Canada is now studying Norwegian maritime emergency procedures, especially towing operations for stricken vessels. These are not glamorous details. They are the connective tissue of an alliance. Now the honest part. Rob Hubert at the University of Calgary has been studying Arctic security longer than most of us have been paying attention. His warning is worth hearing in full. The United States, he reminds anyone who will listen, still produces arguably the most advanced military hardware on the planet. Canadian warfighting capability remains deeply tied to American systems, American satellites, American early warning networks. If a real shooting war erupts in the Arctic, Canada cannot replace what the U.S. brings to the table. Not yet. Maybe not for a very long time. That is the tension at the heart of this entire pivot. Carney is not pretending Canada can fight alone. He is buying insurance. He is widening the circle. He is making sure that if Washington decides Canadian sovereignty is negotiable, and the last several months have made that question uncomfortably real, there are other phone numbers to dial, other ports to enter, other procurement contracts to sign. Hubert noted that until very recently, Canadian participation in NATO Arctic exercises in the Nordics was, in his words, very token. That changed in March, when Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister to set foot in Norway since 1980, flying personally to Bardufoss, north of the Arctic Circle, to observe Cold Response 26. 32,000 troops, 14 nations. NATO's largest Arctic exercise in years. Carney rode through the drills in a Swedish-built CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle alongside Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, while soldiers maneuvered in the snow around them. A prime minister does not fly to the Arctic Circle for symbolism. He flies there to send a signal. The signal was received. Stay with us. This story is moving faster than the news cycle can handle, and we'll be tracking every development as the Greenland Ranger framework comes together by year's end. If you want to be ahead of the headlines on what Canada does next, you know what to do. The bigger picture comes into focus when you stop looking at this as a defense story and start seeing it as a sovereignty story. Trump did not just threaten Greenland, he threatened Canada itself, openly, repeatedly, talking about it as the 51st state. He cannot unsay those words. And the people in Cambridge Bay, in Iqaluit, in Inuvik, heard them clearly. So did the people in Nuuk. So did the people in Helsinki and Stockholm and Reykjavik. Threats compress timelines. Threats forge alliances that nobody would have signed in calmer weather. Carney's bet is straightforward. Middle powers acting together carry weight that no single middle power carries alone. 6 democracies, 2 oceans, 1 shared Arctic frontier, and a willingness to write rules in a region where the rule writers have historically lived in Moscow and Washington. If that bet pays off, the North will look very different by the end of this decade. If it fails, Canada will discover, the hard way, that geography is not destiny, that being big and cold and rich in minerals is not enough when the powers around you decide your sovereignty is conditional. For now, the Rangers are back from their 5,000-kilometer trek. The Greenlanders are studying their playbook. The Nordics are messaging daily. The consulate in Nuuk is open. The defense budget has doubled in real terms over a decade. And Mark Carney is making sure that when history asks where Canada stood the moment its closest ally turned hostile, the answer is not alone. This is Canada Next. I'll see you tomorrow.